Hello and welcome back. If you are here, then you are probably ready to rest. You are probably ready to let the day go, to set down whatever you were carrying, and to simply breathe. So take a moment right now, get comfortable, pull your blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw relax, let your eyes go soft. Good. Tonight, we are going to take a very slow, very gentle journey back in time. We are going back to a period in American history that was very different from today, and yet in some ways surprisingly familiar. We are going back to the 1800s, to a time of candles and wood fires, to a time of dirt roads and handmade quilts, to a time when the night was truly dark and when sleep was something people thought about quite differently than we do now. We are going to explore how ordinary Americans, farmers, mothers, shopkeepers, children, travelers, and neighbors actually slept, how they prepared for sleep, what their bedrooms looked like, what they wore to bed, what they feared in the dark, what they dreamed about, and how they understood those dreams, how they woke up in the middle of the night and what they did in those quiet hours. And along the way, we will drift through their kitchens and their parlors and their small wooden houses and their wide open fields under the stars. We will feel the chill of a winter evening in a New England farmhouse. We will smell the wood smoke. We will hear the distant sound of an owl or a cricket, or the soft breathing of a family all sleeping in the same small room. It is a quiet world we are entering tonight, a slower world. And I think by the end of our time together, you will feel very ready to sleep. So let us begin. Let us take a slow, easy walk into the bedtime world of 1800s America. To truly understand how Americans slept in the 1800s, we first need to understand the world they lived in, because it was a very different world from ours. And one of the biggest differences, one that shaped almost everything about their sleep, was darkness, real darkness. When the sun went down in the 1800s, the world did not simply get a little dimmer. It got genuinely deeply dark. There were no streetlights in most towns. There were no glowing screens in windows. There were no headlights on roads. The darkness outside was the kind of darkness that modern people almost never experience anymore. The kind where you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. Imagine you are standing outside a small farmhouse in, say, Ohio or Virginia or Massachusetts, sometime in the middle of the 1800s. It is about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. The sun set a couple of hours ago, and the world around you is quiet and dark, deeply, softly dark. If there is a moon, there is some pale light. If it is a clear night, there are stars, more stars than most of us ever see today, because there is no light pollution. The sky is thick with them. But even that starlight does not illuminate much. It just gives the world a faint, dreamy glow. Inside the farmhouse, there is a fire in the hearth. There might be a candle or two, maybe a small oil lamp if the family can afford it, but that is it. The light reaches only so far. The corners of the room are dark. The upstairs hallway is dark. The bedrooms, if there are separate bedrooms, are dark. And this darkness, this natural, complete darkness, did something very important. It told the human body that it was time to sleep. You see, the human body has what scientists now call a circadian rhythm. It is a kind of internal clock that responds to light and darkness. When there is light, the body stays awake and alert. When darkness comes, the body begins producing a hormone called melatonin, which makes us feel drowsy and ready for sleep. For most of human history, and certainly for most Americans in the 1800s, this system worked just as it was supposed to. The sun went down, the world got dark, the body got sleepy, and people went to bed. They did not fight it. They did not stay up watching television or scrolling through their phones. When darkness came and candles became expensive and eyes grew tired in the dim light, people simply went to sleep. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In the 1800s, most ordinary working Americans, farmers especially, went to bed very early by modern standards. Not because they were lazy or uninterested in life, but because the night was dark and the body was tired, and there was simply not much else to do once the light was gone. In summer, with long days and warm evenings, people might stay up a bit later. Neighbors might gather on a porch. Children might run in the yard catching fireflies in glass jars. But in winter, with short days and cold nights, many families were in bed by 8 o'clock, sometimes even earlier. That probably sounds very strange to us now. But in the natural world, the world these people lived in, it made perfect sense. The body was following its ancient rhythm, the rhythm it had followed for thousands of years. And there is something about that thought that feels restful. Something about imagining a world where you simply followed the darkness, where you did not resist sleep, where you just let it come. As we settle into this story, let that thought stay with you. The idea that sleep was once something people simply surrendered to, easily and naturally, when the dark arrived. Let us now move a little closer to the house. Let us step inside and look around at the world these people actually slept in. Now, when we think of a bedroom today, we probably picture something fairly private. A room with a door that closes, a bed that belongs to one or two people, maybe some furniture, a dresser, a nightstand, a lamp. A place that is yours, that is quiet, that is separate from the rest of the house. In the 1800s, especially in the early and middle parts of the century, bedrooms were quite different. And for a great many Americans, a private bedroom was actually a luxury they did not have. Let us imagine for a moment a typical working class or farm family in the early 1800s. Maybe they live in a small wooden house somewhere in rural Pennsylvania or Tennessee. The house might have 2 rooms on the ground floor, a kitchen, and a main living area. There might be a sleeping loft up above, reached by a ladder or a narrow staircase. Or there might be one main bedroom off the kitchen, and in that one bedroom, the whole family slept. That is not an exaggeration. It was very common in ordinary American homes of the early 1800s for parents, children, and sometimes grandparents or other relatives to all sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Now, I want you to stay relaxed as I say that, because I know it might sound strange or even uncomfortable, but in that time and place, it was completely normal. It was simply how most people lived. Houses were small because building materials were expensive and labor was hard. Firewood cost money and effort, and heating multiple rooms through a cold winter was difficult. So people shared warmth. They shared space. They slept together. In many families, a large bed, often called the best bed, stood in the main room or the one proper bedroom. This was where the parents slept, and it was also somewhat paradoxically where honored guests might sleep too. The best bed was often actually the nicest piece of furniture in the house. It was a point of pride. Children slept in smaller beds nearby, or on straw mattresses on the floor, or in a pinch on blankets or quilts rolled out wherever there was space. If there were several children, they might share a bed, 2 or 3 at a time, sleeping sideways or curled together for warmth. And no one thought much of this. It was just life. Now, as the century went on and families became more prosperous, especially in towns and cities, things gradually changed. By the middle and later 1800s, the idea of separate bedrooms for parents and children became more common among the growing middle class. Families who could afford it began building houses with more rooms. Publishers of home design books, and there were quite a few of them by the mid 1800s, began writing about the importance of children having their own sleeping spaces for health and moral development. But even then, for millions of Americans, the shared sleeping room remained the reality. Now let us think about what was in these rooms. What did a bed actually look like in the 1800s? For the wealthiest Americans, beds were quite grand. They were large wooden frames with carved headboards and footboards. They had canopies, those beautiful fabric coverings that draped overhead and down the sides, creating a kind of tent around the sleeper. These canopy beds, sometimes called four-poster beds, were practical as well as beautiful. The fabric helped keep drafts out and warmth in on cold nights. They also offered a little visual privacy in a shared room. Underneath the sleeper in a wealthy home, there might be a proper mattress stuffed with horsehair or wool. Then a layer of feather bedding on top. A feather bed, it was called. This was a deep, soft layer of feathers, often from geese or ducks, that the sleeper would sink into. On cold nights, this was incredibly cozy. Imagine sinking into a deep, soft cloud of warmth. That is what a feather bed felt like. But for ordinary Americans, and this is most people, the bed was much simpler. A wooden frame, yes, but the mattress was usually a large cloth bag stuffed with straw or corn husks or dried leaves or whatever material was available. These needed to be restuffed regularly because the filling would compress and break down over time. Families often restuffed their mattresses in the autumn using fresh straw from the harvest. A freshly stuffed straw mattress was considered a real comfort. On top of the mattress went quilts and blankets, and in cold regions and cold seasons, a lot of them. Quilts were not just decorative in the 1800s, they were essential. A family might pile 3 or 4 heavy quilts on the bed in winter, and the weight and warmth of all that fabric was the main source of heat through the night. And speaking of quilts, these were often handmade, made by the women of the household piece by piece during spare winter hours, made from scraps of old clothing and flour sacks and whatever fabric was available. Each quilt told a kind of story of the family's daily life. This piece was from a child's dress. This piece was from an old work shirt. This piece was from a flour sack bought at the general store, all stitched together into something warm and beautiful. Some families had elaborate quilts made at community quilting bees, gatherings where women came together to work on a large quilt all at once. These were social events as much as practical ones. Women would talk and share news and sometimes sing while they worked. And at the end of the day, someone went home with a beautiful new quilt. Doesn't that make you think of your own blanket in a slightly different way? The warmth of something made by hand, made with care. Pillows in the 1800s were also handmade. They were cloth bags stuffed with feathers or cotton or wool. Not quite as fluffy as our modern pillows, perhaps, but soft enough. And the smell of a bedroom in the 1800s, well, that is interesting to think about. There were no synthetic air fresheners, but people used what they had. Dried lavender was sometimes tucked into quilts and pillowcases to help with sleep and to keep away moths and insects. Dried rose petals, dried herbs from the garden, The smells of the bedroom were natural smells: wood, fabric, dried flowers, the faint trace of wood smoke from the fireplace downstairs. There might be a chamber pot under the bed. This was a ceramic pot used for relieving oneself during the night, so that no one had to make the journey outside to the outhouse in the cold and dark. Chamber pots were a completely normal part of life, used by everyone from the poorest farm worker to the President of the United States. They were emptied in the morning, cleaned, and put back in their place. Near the bed, there might be a small wooden table. On it, perhaps, a candle in a simple holder, a Bible or a prayer book, a glass of water, maybe a small jar of some homemade remedy like camphor or mint to help with night ailments. And that was largely it. A 1800s bedroom was a simple place, a functional place. It was for sleeping and for resting. It was not a place to spend much time during the day. In an era before central heating, in fact, most people tried to spend as little time as possible in the cold upstairs rooms during daylight hours. The bedroom was the night place, the sleep place. As the night grows a little quieter around you now, imagine yourself in one of those simple rooms. The fire is dying downstairs. The candlelight is very faint. The quilts are heavy and warm. The world outside is completely dark and completely still. And it is time for sleep. Let us now think about how a typical American family in the 1800s prepared for sleep. What were the rituals of the evening? What did they do as the day wound down and the night came on? These rituals were quite different from ours, and yet they had their own kind of gentle rhythm that I think you will find soothing to think about. Imagine a family, let us say a farming family in Ohio, sometime around 1845. There is a husband and wife, 3 or 4 children of various ages, and perhaps an elderly grandparent living with them. It is autumn. The days are shortening. By the time supper is finished and cleaned up, it is already getting dark outside. The main fire in the hearth is still burning, but it is not being fed as enthusiastically as it was earlier in the evening. Wood is precious. You do not waste it burning a big fire just to sit around it. The family gathers in the warmth of its dying light to do a few last things before bed. The father might do a final check of the barn. This was a nightly ritual for farmers, going out in the dark with a lantern to make sure the animals were settled. The horses, the cows, the pigs, the chickens, all safe and warm. It was a responsibility that could not be skipped, no matter how tired you were. And there was something calming about it, moving slowly through a dark barn with a small lantern, hearing the quiet breathing and shuffling of the animals, the smell of hay and warm bodies, everything in its right place. The mother, meanwhile, might be doing a few last tasks in the kitchen. Banking the fire, which meant arranging the coals carefully so the fire would not go completely out overnight, leaving just enough heat to make starting the morning fire easier. Covering the bread dough that would need to rise overnight. Setting out the items needed for morning. Checking the children. Children in the 1800s were typically put to bed earlier than the adults. In many families, small children went to bed at dusk or shortly after. Older children might be allowed to stay up a little later, especially if they were doing useful things, reading, mending, doing lessons by candlelight. But candlelight was expensive. Candles had to be made or bought, and reading in dim light for too long hurt the eyes. So most families wound down fairly quickly once darkness fell. There was simply no practical reason to stay up very late. Now, The bedtime routine itself, what did it look like? First, for those who could manage it, there was some version of washing. Now, this did not mean a full bath. In the 1800s, a full bath, submerging the whole body in water, was typically done once a week at most, and often less frequently. The amount of labor involved in heating enough water for a full bath was considerable. You had to haul water from a well or a creek. You had to heat it over the fire in large pots. You had to fill a wooden tub. It was a production, but washing the face and hands before bed, this was considered important. A bowl and pitcher of water sat in the bedroom or on a stand nearby. You would pour a little water into the bowl, splash it on your face, maybe scrub your hands, then dry off with a cloth. In winter, this water might be quite cold, painfully cold in fact, if it had been sitting in an unheated room. Some households kept a small pitcher of warmer water by the fire to take upstairs for the evening wash. Hair was another consideration. Women in the 1800s typically wore their hair pinned up during the day. At night, they would unpin it, brush it out, and braid it loosely for sleeping. Long hair that was left loose could tangle badly during the night. And many women had very long hair. Cutting women's hair was not particularly fashionable or common through most of the century. Men kept their hair shorter generally, but many men in the 1800s had beards, especially by the middle and later part of the century. Some men would give their beard a quick comb before bed. Others did not bother. Then there were the teeth. Toothbrushes existed in the 1800s. They had bristle brushes, usually with bone or wood handles, and tooth powder was used in place of toothpaste, a gritty mixture of things like baking soda, chalk, charcoal, or various herbs. But dental care was not practiced as consistently or as thoroughly as we try to practice it today. And as a result, tooth problems were quite common and quite painful. A toothache in the 1800s was a serious thing. Now, what did people wear to bed? In the 1800s, sleeping in the nude was generally not considered respectable, at least not in the mainstream culture. Most people wore some form of nightclothes. For women and girls, this typically meant a long nightgown. These were usually made of white or pale cotton or linen. They were long, floor-length or close to it, with long sleeves and a high neck, plain and simple, comfortable. Sometimes they had a little embroidery around the collar or cuffs in wealthier households. For men and boys, the typical nightwear was a nightshirt, essentially the same shape as a woman's nightgown, just perhaps a little less adorned, long, loose, white or pale, reaching down to the knees or below. Many men also wore a nightcap, a soft fabric hat worn to bed to keep the head warm. These nightcaps were quite common, especially in colder climates and seasons. Losing heat from the head during sleep was considered a real concern, and without central heating, a cold bedroom made a nightcap feel very practical. Children wore similar nightgowns or nightshirts. Very small children might have additional layers, wool socks for instance, to keep their feet warm. Once in nightclothes, there was usually a moment of prayer. In most American homes of the 1800s, prayer was a genuine and regular part of daily life, morning and evening. The evening prayer might be said quietly alone, or it might be said as a family kneeling by the bed. The words might be familiar ones, memorized since childhood, the Lord's Prayer perhaps, or a simple blessing, a quiet giving of thanks for the day, a request for safety through the night. There is something lovely about this practice, whatever your own beliefs. The idea of pausing at the end of the day to be grateful, to acknowledge that the day is done, to let it go. After prayers, the candle was blown out. Or sometimes, if you were the last one going to bed and the candle was needed to light the way upstairs, you carried it with you, shielded it carefully against any draft, and then blew it out at the very last moment once you were settled. And then the darkness came. Real darkness, complete darkness, and the quilts were pulled up. The body warmth began to build under the covers, and the mind began to drift. This is the place we are drifting toward together tonight. That warm, quilted darkness, that silence. Let us stay in it for a little while as we continue our story. Now, here is something genuinely fascinating, something that might surprise you, something that, once you hear it, might actually make you feel better about your own nighttime experience. In the 1800s, and actually for most of human history before artificial light, people did not sleep the way we sleep today. They did not go to bed, sleep straight through for 8 hours, and then wake up in the morning. That was not the common pattern. Instead, most people slept in two separate phases, two distinct sleeps with a quiet, wakeful period in between. Historians and sleep researchers have written about this quite a bit. A historian named Roger Ekirch spent years studying documents from the past, diaries, court records, medical texts, letters, literature, and found reference after reference to this two-part sleep pattern. People in the historical record wrote quite casually about their first sleep and their second sleep, as if everyone knew what those terms meant, because everyone did. Here is roughly how it worked. A family would go to bed relatively early, say around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, perhaps a couple of hours after full darkness. They would fall asleep. This first sleep would last for several hours, perhaps 3 or 4 hours. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, around midnight, or 1 or 2 in the morning, they would naturally wake up. And this waking was not like our experience of waking up in the middle of the night. It was not alarming or frustrating. It was not sleep trouble. It was simply the middle of the night, a natural resting point, a pause. During this middle of the night waking period, people did various things. Some lay quietly in bed, thinking or praying. Some talked softly to their spouse or their bedfellow. Some got up and moved around the house. Some used the chamber pot. Some ate a small snack if they were hungry. Some read by candlelight if they could afford the candle. Some did light tasks, knitting, thinking over problems, planning the next day. Some went to check on the animals or the fire. And then, after an hour or two of this quiet wakefulness, they fell back to sleep again. The second sleep, this would last until morning or until it was time to rise. This pattern was so normal in historical times that the medical wisdom of the era actually incorporated it. Doctors wrote that the period between the two sleeps was a good time for couples to be intimate. It was a time when the mind was calm and relaxed. Some spiritual advisors suggested it was a particularly good time for prayer and reflection, a quiet liminal hour when the mind was open and peaceful. People were not anxious about waking in the middle of the night. They expected it, they used the time, and then they slept again. Now, and this is worth sitting with, researchers believe this two-sleep pattern is actually the natural human sleep rhythm, the one our bodies default to when there is no artificial light to confuse our internal clocks. When the long, dark winter nights of pre-electric life pressed down, the body found its own rhythm. And that rhythm involved waking and resting and waking again. It was only after artificial lighting became widespread gas lamps in the mid-1800s, then electric lights at the century's end, that this two-sleep pattern began to disappear. As people started staying up later into the evening, the window for sleep compressed. The quiet middle of the night waking period got squeezed out, and people began to sleep in one long block as we try to do today. But for most of our story tonight, for most of the 1800s, the two-sleep pattern was simply how American life worked. And there is something quietly reassuring about knowing that if you wake up in the middle of the night tonight, if you lie there in the quiet darkness thinking soft thoughts, you are, in a way, doing something deeply human, something ancient, something your great-great-great-grandparents would have recognized completely. So now let us think about those quiet hours between the first and second sleep. What was life like in the middle of the night hours in a typical 1800s home? Imagine it. The house is dark. The fire has burned low, just embers glowing faintly in the hearth. The world outside is utterly quiet. Maybe there is wind in the trees, maybe an owl calling in the distance, maybe nothing at all, just silence so deep it has a kind of sound of its own. And here is a man, a farmer perhaps, lying awake in the dark between his first and second sleep. His wife is breathing softly beside him. The children are asleep in their beds nearby. The house is cold away from the fire. The quilts are warm. He might lie there thinking about the farm. Tomorrow he needs to turn over the south field. The cow has been off her feed. He should check the fence along the creek before winter comes. His mind moves through these thoughts slowly, without urgency. There is nothing to do about any of it right now. It is the middle of the night. These are just thoughts floating gently. Or maybe he prays quietly, internally, a simple, wordless gratitude. Or he lies there listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of wood settling in the cold, the distant sound of an animal shifting in the barn. Everything familiar, everything in its place. Maybe his wife wakes too, and they whisper for a little while. Not about anything important. Just the quiet conversation of two people who have shared a life. The simple comfort of a warm human voice in the dark. After a while, the thoughts get slower. The body gets heavier. The darkness gets softer. And sleep comes again, gently, naturally. The second sleep, deep and restoring. Let that image settle over you now. The second sleep coming in, the deep, quiet darkness, the warm weight of quilts. There is no rush. There is nowhere to be. There is only the night and rest. Now, our nighttime story would not be complete if we only talked about the peaceful side of sleep in the 1800s, because the night in the 1800s was not always peaceful. It was sometimes genuinely frightening. We will keep this section calm and gentle. There is nothing scary here, I promise. But understanding what people feared in the dark tells us a great deal about how they thought about sleep and night and the unseen world. And there is actually something very comforting about hearing these fears spoken aloud, because they remind us how much safety we have found in our own modern nighttime world. The first and most practical fear was fire. Fire was the source of warmth and light in the 1800s, but it was also the greatest danger. House fires were terrifyingly common. A spark from the hearth that landed on a rug, a candle left burning too close to a curtain, a chimney that had not been cleaned and now had a buildup of creosote that could suddenly ignite. A child who knocked over a lantern. Houses in the 1800s were made of wood. They burned fast and completely. And at night, when the family was asleep, a fire could take hold before anyone knew it was happening. This fear was real enough that many families had specific nighttime fire routines. The fire in the hearth was always carefully banged before bed, the logs arranged so they would die down slowly rather than burn hot and throw sparks. The hearth rug was sometimes removed from in front of the fire at night and replaced in the morning. Candles were never left burning overnight unless absolutely necessary. Some families had a designated person, often the father or an older child, who would do one last check of the house before bed, making sure all flames were accounted for. And still, fires happened. Families lost homes. Families lost everything. This fear was not irrational. It was based on real experience. The second fear was illness in the night. In the 1800s, before modern medicine, many illnesses moved fast and struck hard. A child might seem perfectly healthy at bedtime and be burning with fever by midnight. People feared what they called night air. There was a widespread belief that the night air itself was somehow dangerous, that breathing it could bring on fevers and illness. This belief was actually not entirely without some basis. Certain diseases like malaria were indeed connected to nighttime, carried by the mosquitoes that came out after dark. But the broad superstition about bad night air led to some interesting habits. Many people slept with their windows tightly closed, even in summer. They stuffed fabric into window cracks to keep the night air out. They worried about drafts. The irony is that sleeping in a tightly closed room with many people could itself cause health problems, poor ventilation, sharing of germs. But the fear of outside air was real and widespread. Beyond practical fears, there were the fears of the imagination. The darkness of the 1800s night was absolute. And in absolute darkness, the mind has a way of filling in the gaps. American folk culture in the 1800s was rich with stories of ghosts and spirits and things that moved in the night. These were not just children's stories. Adults believed in them too, or at least half believed. People told stories of spirits of the dead returning to familiar places. They spoke of strange lights seen in the swamps and fields at night, what they called will-o'-the-wisps, which were probably natural gas igniting, but which looked to a frightened imagination like the lanterns of dead souls. There were beliefs about the dead not resting peacefully, about hauntings, about strange sounds in the night having supernatural explanations. If the door rattled in the wind, someone might whisper a prayer. If an animal cried strangely outside, it might be taken as an omen. And there was the fear, very widespread in America, especially in rural areas, of what lurked in the woods at night. Real animals, yes. Bears and wolves were genuine threats in many parts of the country, especially earlier in the century. A farmer with livestock had real reasons to fear predators, but mixed in with these practical fears were older, stranger fears. Things half remembered from fairy tales or old country folklore brought over from Europe. Things that went bump in the night. Children, of course, were particularly susceptible to nighttime fears. Many children in the 1800s were genuinely afraid of the dark in ways that adults took seriously. Nighttime terrors, what we would now call night terrors or nightmares, were well known. Parents had various ways of comforting frightened children. A parent might come and sit with a child by their bed in the dark. might sing softly, might say prayers together. The physical presence of a parent, the warmth of a hand, the sound of a familiar voice, these were the remedies for nighttime fear. And sometimes, and this is rather charming, children were allowed to sleep with a candle left burning very low, just the tiniest flame, enough to soften the darkness, not eliminate it, but soften it. Adults managed their nighttime fears in similar ways. Prayer was a great comfort, the belief that they were watched over by a divine presence, that they were not alone in the dark. This was genuinely sustaining for most Americans of the 1800s who were deeply and sincerely religious. There were also more practical measures. Many families kept a loaded gun near the bedroom door, not for supernatural threats, but for very real ones, burglars, thieves, or other human dangers. In an era without police forces in most rural areas, you were responsible for your own safety at night. But I want you to notice something. Even as we talk about these fears, even as we acknowledge that the 1800s night was sometimes genuinely frightening, there is still something deeply peaceful about the picture as a whole, because these fears were faced and managed within a world of deep quiet, within a world of darkness and slowness and simple living. The fears of that time, in their way, only make the peace of that time feel more precious. The fire is carefully banked. The prayer is said. The quilts are pulled up. The family is close. And sleep comes. Let us move on now into other aspects of 1800s sleep life. As the night deepens around you, let yourself feel safe and warm. Nothing can reach you here. You are resting gently in the dark. In the 1800s, sleep was taken very seriously as a matter of health. People thought about sleep a great deal, perhaps more consciously than we do today. There was a lot of written advice about how to sleep properly, how much sleep was ideal, what conditions produced the best sleep, and what to do when sleep would not come. Let us drift gently through some of these ideas. The medical wisdom of the early 1800s was rooted partly in science and partly in tradition, and quite a lot of it sounds strange to us now. But it was sincere, and it often had its own kind of logic. One of the most debated questions among health writers of the era was, how much sleep does a person actually need? There was a surprising range of opinions. Some physicians and health reformers believed that most people slept far too much. They argued that the body needed only 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and that sleeping longer was a kind of self-indulgence. These writers often had a moralistic tone. They associated long sleeping with laziness. The ideal, in the view of many health reformers of the early to mid-1800s, was to wake early, rise promptly, and not linger in bed. Early to bed and early to rise, the saying went. And it was not just a saying, it was a genuine piece of health wisdom that many Americans took seriously. Benjamin Franklin had written it, and Benjamin Franklin was widely admired. The idea that early rising was virtuous and healthy ran very deep in American culture of this era. Other writers, however, argued differently. They believed the body needed 7, 8, even 9 hours of sleep to truly restore itself. They argued that the quality of sleep mattered as much as the quantity, and that deep, undisturbed sleep in a dark, well-ventilated room was far more valuable than a long sleep in a hot, stuffy, overcrowded space. The debate about sleep was connected to the broader health reform movements of the 1800s. This was an era of enthusiastic health reforming. People like Sylvester Graham, who also gave us the graham cracker, though the original was much less sweet, wrote extensively about natural living, natural sleeping, proper diet, and fresh air as the foundations of health. Graham was quite opinionated about beds. He thought feather beds, those luxurious, soft, deep piles of feathers, were actually unhealthy. Too soft, he argued. They made the body too hot. They did not allow proper rest of the muscles. Graham recommended sleeping on a firmer surface, with the window slightly open for fresh air. Many people ignored Graham's advice. Feather beds were wonderfully comfortable and people loved them. But his ideas were part of a wider conversation about sleep hygiene that was quite lively in the 1800s. There were also strong opinions about sleeping position. Lying on the right side was generally considered the healthiest position by most physicians of the era. Lying on the left side was thought to put pressure on the heart, which was not ideal. Lying on the back was acceptable. Lying face down was considered poor for breathing and generally uncomfortable. Whether any of this was medically accurate is another question, but it tells us how carefully people thought about the mechanics of sleep. What about when sleep would not come? What did 1800s Americans do about insomnia? Insomnia, difficulty sleeping, was recognized and written about throughout the 1800s. It was considered a real medical problem connected to things like nervous exhaustion, overwork, excessive worry, and what doctors called dyspepsia, which was basically their term for digestive trouble, which they believed was connected to almost everything. The remedies for insomnia in the 1800s ranged from very sensible to quite unusual. On the sensible side, taking a brief walk in the evening air before bed, eating a light supper rather than a heavy one, reading something gentle and unexciting before sleep, avoiding coffee and tea in the hours before bed. Caffeine's effects were understood, at least in practice, even if the word caffeine itself was not widely used in common speech. Warm baths were sometimes recommended before bed for those who could manage them. The warmth was soothing to the nervous system. A cup of warm milk was considered helpful, something we still hear today. Warm milk has genuine, mild, sleep-promoting properties, and 1800s folk wisdom had figured this out long before modern science explained why. Then there were the more unusual remedies. Herbal preparations were very widely used. Chamomile tea was popular, and chamomile genuinely does have mild calming effects. Valerian root was used. It has a somewhat unpleasant smell, but was believed to promote sleep, and modern research suggests it may have mild sedative effects. Hops, the plant used in brewing beer, were also thought to be calming, and people sometimes stuffed pillows with dried hop flowers. There were smelling salts and lavender sachets placed under pillows. Some people recommended putting a bar of soap under the mattress. This was thought to help with restless legs, a belief that persists in folk medicine even today. Whether it worked is doubtful, but the comfort of having done something, of having tried a remedy, probably helped some people relax. In more extreme cases of insomnia or sleeplessness, doctors might prescribe laudanum. Laudanum was a liquid preparation containing opium dissolved in alcohol. It was legal, widely available, and considered a legitimate medicine throughout much of the 1800s. It did indeed make people sleep, but it was also powerfully addictive, and many Americans of the era became dependent on it without fully understanding the risks. By the late 1800s, concern about laudanum and similar preparations was growing, but they remained in use. There were also preparations made with chloral hydrate, one of the first chemical sleep aids, which became available in the later 1800s. Again, effective but not without its dangers. But for most ordinary Americans, the approaches to sleep trouble were much simpler: prayer and trust, a warm drink, a familiar bedtime routine, the comfort of a family member nearby, and the deep, dark quiet of the nighttime world doing its work naturally. Let us think also about what people believed about dreams in the 1800s. Dreams were taken seriously, more seriously perhaps than many of us take them today. In a culture deeply shaped by the Bible, dreams had spiritual significance. The Old Testament was full of meaningful dreams, dreams that carried prophecy, divine messages, warnings. Many Americans of the 1800s believed that their own dreams might carry genuine meaning. A vivid dream might be a message from God, or perhaps a warning about a coming event. There were also more superstitious traditions about dreams. Popular dream dictionaries were published and widely read, books that claimed to tell you what various dream images meant. Dreaming of water meant one thing. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant another. Dreaming of a bird meant something else. These little books were published in large numbers and tucked into households alongside the Bible and the almanac. The relationship between dreams and daily life was much more intertwined in the 1800s than it is for most of us today. If a woman dreamed of a particular young man, she might wonder seriously if it was a sign about her romantic future. If a farmer dreamed of flooding, he might actually alter his planting plans. Dreams were woven into the fabric of waking life in a way that feels quite distant to modern thinking, but which tells us something about the intimacy people had with their own sleeping minds. And with that, let us drift on. Let us move from the sleeping mind to the sleeping body and think now about some of the more specific and personal aspects of 1800s bedtime life. We have talked about the family home and the family bed. But the 1800s was also a time of great movement across America, of people traveling by horse, by wagon, by riverboat, by the new steam trains that were beginning to crisscross the continent by the mid-century. And when travelers needed to sleep, the experience could be memorable. Let us take a slow walk down a muddy road in, say, 1830s Indiana. A traveler, perhaps a merchant or a circuit preacher or a man looking for land to settle, has been on the road since dawn. The light is fading. His horse is tired. And up ahead, just visible through the trees, there is the warm light of a tavern. Or perhaps just a farmhouse where the traveler can knock and ask for a night's lodging. In rural America in the early 1800s, the hospitality system for travelers was quite informal. There were taverns and inns along the main roads, but between them there could be long stretches of wilderness with nowhere to stop. A traveler who found themselves far from a town at nightfall might simply knock on the nearest farmhouse door and ask if he could sleep somewhere, in the barn, on the floor, or if he was lucky, in a spare bed. Most people said yes. Offering hospitality to travelers was considered a moral and social duty. The traveler might pay a small sum for his lodging and perhaps a meal. Or, in very remote areas, the exchange might be purely one of neighborliness. You helped a stranger because someday you might need help yourself. Now, in the taverns and boarding houses along the better traveled roads, the sleeping arrangements were often remarkable by modern standards. Private rooms were available only in the best establishments in the larger towns. In a typical roadside tavern, travelers were simply shown to a sleeping room, and in that sleeping room would be one or several beds. And those beds would be shared by whatever travelers happened to arrive that night. This practice, sharing a bed with a complete stranger, was so common that it barely raised an eyebrow in the early and middle 1800s. It was just what happened when you traveled. You arrived at the tavern. You ate supper with the other travelers. You went upstairs to the common sleeping room. You found a space in one of the beds. You arranged your coat over yourself as an extra blanket or pulled up whatever quilts were available, and you slept. Sometimes these sleeping rooms held many beds and many people. Sometimes a single bed might have 3 or 4 men in it, sleeping pressed together for warmth, all strangers. Several travelers in the 1800s wrote about these experiences in their diaries and letters, and the descriptions range from cheerful to wryly amused to quietly horrified. Some travelers were perfectly content with the arrangement. Others were deeply bothered by it, by the snoring of strangers, by the scratching and shuffling, by the smells, by the close proximity of unknown bodies. A few famous visitors to America wrote about these experiences with some astonishment. European visitors, in particular, were sometimes shocked by the lack of privacy in American inns. They had expected something more refined and instead found themselves sharing a lumpy bed with a total stranger who chewed tobacco and snored like a locomotive. But for most Americans, especially those accustomed to sharing sleeping space with family, the tavern sleeping room was simply another version of something familiar. You made do, you were tired, you slept. There was also the practice of what was sometimes called bundling in the earlier part of the century, a tradition particularly in New England and among certain communities, where a courting couple might spend the night in the same bed with a board or rolled blanket between them as a way of allowing them to talk and get to know each other without going further. This was a practical arrangement in crowded homes where private conversation was difficult, and it was considered acceptable within appropriate community standards. It sounds unusual to modern ears, but it had its own very specific social rules and expectations. The world of sleep in the 1800s then was a much more shared communal world than our own. Privacy in sleep was a luxury. Most people slept alongside others, whether family or strangers. And this shaped a certain ease with the physical proximity of other human beings during the night, a comfort in the warmth of nearby bodies, a familiarity with the sounds of other people breathing and shifting in the dark. There is something actually that feels very human about that, something that reaches back to our oldest instincts, the instinct to gather together in the dark, to be near others, to feel less alone in the long night. As the night grows deeper around you now, notice the sounds of your own environment. The quiet breathing of the house around you, the distant sounds of the world settling into sleep. And let yourself feel in some small way part of that long, ancient human tradition of resting together. One of the most beautiful aspects of sleep life in the 1800s was how deeply it was connected to the natural world, to the turning of seasons, the length of days, the temperature of the air. In a world without climate control, sleep changed dramatically with the time of year. And that seasonal rhythm of sleep had its own kind of loveliness. Let us begin with winter. Imagine a winter night in rural New England, say, in Vermont or Maine, sometime in the 1840s. It is January. The temperature outside has dropped well below freezing. The snow is deep. The world beyond the walls of the house is white and silent and cold beyond imagining. Inside, the family has been preparing all evening for the long, cold night ahead. The fire has been burning all day in the main room, and the house has been warm and relatively comfortable. But as bedtime approaches, the fire is banked, and the warmth in the upper rooms, where there is no fire at all, begins to drop rapidly. Going to bed in winter in New England was a deliberate and somewhat bracing act. You left the relative warmth of the downstairs room and climbed to the cold bedroom, knowing it would be quite cold up there. Sometimes a family had a small warming pan, a metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals from the fire that they would run quickly under the bed covers before climbing in. Just enough to take the worst of the chill off the sheets. Then came the quilts. In serious winter, you might sleep under 3, 4, even 5 heavy quilts. The weight of them was itself a kind of comfort. The pressure, the warmth, the feeling of being safely enclosed. You wore your nightshirt, your nightcap, perhaps your wool socks. Some people slept with their outer clothing layered on top of the quilts for extra warmth. The cold of the room outside the bed was quite real. Your breath would make little clouds of vapor in the air. The window might be frosted over. The water in the pitcher by the bed might be skimmed with ice by morning. But under the quilts, you were warm, deeply, completely warm. The body heat of your bedfellows added to your own. The weight of the bedding pressed down gently. And the cold outside somehow made the warmth inside feel even better, even more precious. There is a particular quality of winter sleep that many people, even now, recognize. When it is cold outside and warm in bed, the bed feels more inviting than at any other time. The contrast between the cold air on your face and the warmth over the rest of your body is deeply pleasing. Your body goes heavy, your mind goes quiet, sleep comes easily and deeply. For 1800s Americans, winter nights were long, very long. In the northern states, January darkness might last from 4 in the afternoon until 7 in the morning. 15 hours of darkness. And since there was little to do by lamplight, and since going to bed early conserved candles and fuel, people slept long winter nights. 9 hours, 10 hours, 11 hours. Curled deep under their mountain of quilts, dreaming their winter dreams. Now, let us move to summer. Imagine a summer night in, say, Virginia or the Carolinas sometime in the 1850s. It is July. The day has been hot, genuinely, oppressively hot, the kind of summer heat that these southern states were known for. The sun set an hour or two ago, but the air is still thick and warm. There is a faint breeze, perhaps, stirring the curtains. Sleep in summer was a different kind of challenge. Instead of fighting cold, you were fighting heat, and heat makes sleep difficult. Houses in the 1800s had no fans, no air conditioning, no refrigeration. The only way to manage summer heat was with architectural common sense and open windows. Houses in hot climates were often designed with this in mind. High ceilings to let hot air rise and collect above the heads of the inhabitants. Large windows that could be opened to allow cross-ventilation. Shaded porches that provided a cooler outdoor space in the evening. People slept with their windows open in summer, despite the fear of night air. The practical need for cool air generally overcame the theoretical worry. Windows were often left not just cracked but fully open, with only a gauze or thin muslin curtain between the sleeper and the night outside. In hot weather, the bedding was greatly reduced. Gone were the winter quilts. In their place, a single light sheet, maybe a thin summer quilt, just enough to cover the body. Some people in very hot weather slept on the floor, where the air was marginally cooler. Some slept on the porch, particularly in the South, where sleeping porches were a practical and beloved feature of the nighttime culture. A sleeping porch was exactly what it sounds like. A porch often screened, where a bed or cots were set up for warm weather sleeping. The outdoor air was cooler than the house interior. The sounds of the night were right there, the crickets singing, the frogs in the nearby pond, the occasional whippoorwill sleeping on a porch on a summer night in the 1800s. I want you to imagine that for a moment. A simple cot, a light sheet, the warm dark air all around you, the sounds of the summer night, all those insects, all that living, stars overhead through the screen, and the slow, drowsy drift towards sleep under the open sky. There is something in that image that feels almost unbearably peaceful. The idea of sleeping outside in the warm dark, in the midst of all that quiet, natural sound. People also managed summer sleep challenges by adjusting their schedule. In very hot regions, some families adopted a practice similar to the Mediterranean siesta, a midday rest during the hottest hours when the sun was at its peak and work was nearly impossible. Then cooler work in the late afternoon and evening, and a later bedtime when the temperature had dropped. This seasonal flexibility in sleep, the long winter nights and the hot, shorter summer nights, was another aspect of how deeply connected 1800s Americans were to the natural world. Sleep was not a fixed, standardized, year-round activity. It breathed with the seasons, it flexed and adapted, it followed the sun and the darkness and the temperature. And there is something very wise about that, something worth thinking about as you drift towards sleep yourself tonight, in whatever season you find yourself in. Let us now think gently about the children of the 1800s and their sleep lives, because children's sleep in this era was both like and unlike our own children's sleep today. Children were everywhere in 1800s America. Families were large by modern standards. It was not uncommon for a family to have 6, 8, even 10 children. Children were an economic necessity on farms where there was always work to be done. And in an era of high child mortality, when childhood illnesses could be fatal and doctors had limited tools, parents tended to have many children partly because they expected to lose some. This is a somewhat sobering thought, but I mention it because it shaped the emotional texture of family life in the 1800s, including the emotional texture of nighttime and sleep. Parents watched their sleeping children with a particular kind of attention. Checking a child's breathing in the night was not an anxious, neurotic habit. It was a practical act of love and vigilance, because children could and did become seriously ill very suddenly, and the nighttime was when fevers often spiked. Children in the 1800s went to bed early, generally with or before full darkness. For very young children, bedtime might be as early as 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. Older children might be allowed to stay up until 8 or even 9 if they were useful, helping with evening chores, or minding younger siblings, or doing their lessons. Putting children to bed in the 1800s was a ritual that most families took seriously. It often included some form of washing up, face and hands, perhaps feet. Then the change into nightclothes. Then prayer. And for many families, this was a real and meaningful moment. Kneeling by the bed, the child saying their prayers, perhaps with a parent's hand on their shoulder. A brief, sincere turning of the heart toward the divine before sleep. And then, for many children, the ritual of a bedtime story or a song. Lullabies have been around as long as human beings, and 1800s America had its share of them. Some were Old English and Scottish songs brought over from Europe, passed down through generations. Some were newer songs written and published as American popular music began to develop in the mid-century. Some were simply songs a mother made up herself, humming softly to a restless child in the dark. The act of singing a child to sleep, of using the human voice to carry a small person from wakefulness into dreaming, is one of the most ancient and universal human practices. And in the 1800s, before recorded music, before radios or speakers, the voice you heard was always a living voice, the breath and warmth of an actual person, a mother, a grandmother, an older sister. There is something I find deeply moving about that. The idea of a lullaby being a completely live, fully present, unrecorded act of love, sung into the actual ear of an actual child in the actual dark of an actual winter night. Gone as soon as it was sung, but not forgotten. Children in large families typically shared sleeping spaces with siblings. As I mentioned earlier, it was very common for 2 or 3 children to share a bed. And in the hierarchy of the shared bed, the youngest and smallest child typically went in the middle, where it was warmest and safest. The older children on either side provided warmth and a kind of unconscious protection. Children who were frightened of the dark, and many were, had various remedies offered to them. A parent sitting nearby until they fell asleep. A small light left burning. Prayers. The reassurance that God was watching. The physical comfort of a sibling's warmth beside them in the dark. Nightmares were considered a serious matter in the 1800s, not something to dismiss or minimize. When a child woke screaming from a bad dream, parents generally came quickly. The child was held, spoken to softly, perhaps rocked. The frightening dream was treated with compassion rather than impatience. There were also various folk remedies and superstitions around children's sleep troubles. A child who could not sleep might have a piece of coral hung around their neck. Coral was thought to have protective and calming properties. A child who had bad dreams might have certain herbs placed under their pillow. A child who cried at night might have the cause attributed to teething or to colic or to a spell of some kind. And there were various folk treatments, some practical, some quite magical in their thinking. Teething was a genuine terror for parents in the 1800s. A teething baby who would not sleep was not just an exhausting problem, it was genuinely worrying, because in an era when infant mortality was high, any sign of illness or prolonged distress in a baby was frightening. Teething remedies included rubbing the gums with brandy, applying various herbal preparations, giving the baby hard things to chew on, and hanging certain objects around the neck as protection and comfort. As children grew older, their relationship with sleep and the night evolved. Boys, especially by the time they were 7 or 8 or 10, were expected to show a kind of stoic bravery about darkness and nighttime fears. Showing fear of the dark was considered unmanly and childish, so older boys learned to suppress their fears or to channel them into a rough kind of bravado, daring each other to walk past the cemetery in the dark. or to stand at the window of the supposedly haunted house. Girls had slightly more permission to express nighttime fears, though they too were expected to grow out of excessive fear as they matured. Young women were expected to be composed and capable, able to manage a household independently if necessary, including managing through the night. But underneath all of this, the universal experience of childhood in the 1800s included the same things it includes today. The way a child's breathing slows as sleep comes, the way small hands relax and open, the way a sleeping child looks completely peaceful, completely innocent, completely safe. Parents watched their sleeping children in the 1800s, just as parents watch sleeping children today, with that same mixture of love and wonder and relief. Let us carry that quiet image with us as we move deeper into our nighttime story. No discussion of sleep in the 1800s would be complete without acknowledging what happened in the household when someone was seriously ill. Because illness was a constant presence in 1800s life. And when illness came, it changed everything about the nighttime. In an era without hospitals as we know them, and the hospitals that existed were often places of last resort associated with poverty and death rather than healing, the sick were cared for at home. This was universal. A sick person remained in their own bed, in their own room, surrounded by their family. The care was provided by family members, primarily by women. Nursing the sick was considered a fundamental part of a woman's role in 1800s America. From a young age, girls observed and participated in the care of ill family members. They learned how to take a temperature by touch, how to change bedclothes, how to brew medicinal teas, how to cool a feverish forehead with a damp cloth. By the time they were adults, most women were experienced caregivers. And the nighttime care of a sick person was the most demanding part. Because illness is unpredictable in the night. Fevers rise, pain intensifies. The sick person becomes frightened in the dark. They need water. They need comfort. They need someone to be there. So when someone in the household was seriously ill, someone would sit up through the night to watch over them. This person, almost always a woman, would sit beside the sickbed in the dim light, awake and watchful, while the rest of the family slept. She might doze in her chair briefly between checks of the patient, but essentially she kept vigil through the long, dark hours. This was exhausting work, and it was tender work, and it was sometimes heartbreaking work. The sick room at night had its own particular atmosphere, a small lamp or candle burning low, the smell of medicines and herbs, perhaps camphor or mint, or the steam of a pot of water on the hob with some eucalyptus in it, the sound of the patient's breathing, watched for any changes, the sound of the house around them, everyone else asleep. Mothers sat up with sick children. Daughters sat up with ill parents, wives sat up with husbands, sisters sat up with brothers. This nighttime vigil was a form of love that did not announce itself. It simply appeared night after night for as long as it was needed. Many women of the 1800s recorded these experiences in their diaries. The combination of exhaustion and worry and love that fills these entries is deeply recognizable. A woman writing at 2 in the morning that her child's fever has broken and she can finally breathe again. Another writing that her mother made it through the night, but that she fears for the coming day. Another, in a few spare words, writing that she is very tired and very afraid. These women who sat up through the sick nights of the 1800s deserve a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Their care was invisible in many ways. It did not make the history books. It did not earn them wages. It did not bring them recognition. But it sustained the lives of the people they loved, night after quiet night. When the sick person recovered, when the crisis passed and the fever broke and the color came back to their face, the return of normal nighttime life must have felt profoundly sweet. The ability to simply go to bed, to lie down, to sleep without worry, to let the night be just the night again, quiet and ordinary. And when recovery did not come, when the loss was real and final, the nights that followed were different in another way. Grief in the 1800s was not hidden away. It was acknowledged, ritualized, and shared. When someone died, the family would often keep a final nighttime vigil with the body, sitting through that last night before burial, keeping company with the person who had gone. This practice, which might seem strange to us now, was a genuine act of love and respect. A final night together, a long, quiet farewell. These darker aspects of 1800s nighttime life remind us how present death and illness were in the ordinary experience of the time. But they also remind us of something else, the depth of human care that was practiced in those simple lamplit rooms, the kind of care that never asks for recognition, that simply shows up and stays. Let us carry that gentleness with us now as we move toward the end of our story. We have spent a long, peaceful time in the night together. Let us now very gently move toward the morning, because how 1800s Americans woke up tells us as much about their sleep lives as anything else. Waking up in the 1800s was not done with an alarm clock, at least not for most people. Not for most of the century. Alarm clocks did exist by the mid-1800s, but they were not widely owned. Most ordinary families woke up by other means. The most reliable of these was simply the body's own clock. In a world where people went to bed at a regular time, when darkness fell, and slept until their body was genuinely rested, waking up was something that simply happened at the right time. You went to sleep when you were tired. You woke up when you were done sleeping. The body handled it. There were also natural alarms. The rooster, that great and ancient alarm clock, was a genuine feature of morning life for farm families. A rooster crowing at first light was not a cliché. It was real, and it worked. The sound of a rooster piercing the quiet of early morning absolutely woke people up. Then there was the light, the slow arrival of dawn, the sky beginning to pale in the east, the darkness softening, the birds beginning to sing. This was the natural signal for rising. In summer, this might come quite early, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. In winter, the dawn was later, and rising in winter could mean getting up into genuine darkness or near darkness and lighting the first candle or lamp of the day. The first act of most mornings in a farm household was rekindling the fire. This was often the husband's task, or sometimes an older child's. Getting up out of the warm bed, moving through the cold house, crouching at the hearth and carefully bringing the banked embers back to life, feeding small sticks of kindling, blowing gently on the coals, watching the first small flame catch and grow. There was something satisfying and fundamental about this act, bringing warmth back into the cold house, restoring the day's heart. Once the fire was going, the morning routines began. Water to be heated, animals to be fed, breakfast to be made, children to be roused, the whole machinery of daily life cranking slowly back into motion. But before all of that, in many religious households, there was morning prayer. Just as the evening had ended with a prayer, the morning began with one, a brief acknowledgement of the new day, a gratitude for having woken, a readiness for whatever the day would bring. For farm families, especially in the busy seasons, waking was early and rising was immediate. There was no lying in bed on a Tuesday morning in May when there was planting to do. You woke, you got up, you worked. But in winter, with less pressing outdoor work and with cold and darkness as genuine deterrents to getting up, some households allowed themselves a little more ease in the morning, lying in the warm bed for a few extra minutes, dozing while the fire caught and the house began to warm, listening to the muffled silence of a snow-covered world outside. And for those lucky enough to be part of a household where the first morning work was done by someone else, an older child, a household servant, a husband, there might be a brief, lovely period of half sleep in the warming room, a drowsy, comfortable state between full sleep and full waking, not quite asleep, not quite awake. Warm under the quilts while the sounds of the morning household came softly through the walls. This liminal morning state, this drowsy, warm, half-conscious space, is one of the most pleasant of all human experiences. And people in the 1800s knew it just as well as we do. Perhaps even better in a way, because they did not feel guilty about it. They had worked hard, they had slept their natural sleep. The morning would come fully in its own time. Let us linger here for just a moment, in that warm, half-awake space, between sleep and morning, safe, rested, warm. Throughout everything we have talked about tonight, there has been an unspoken thread that it is worth pulling out into the open now. The thread of difference, of how sleep in the 1800s varied enormously depending on who you were and what resources you had. Because the comfortable farm family sleeping under a mountain of handmade quilts in their two-room house, they slept very differently from the wealthy merchant sleeping in his grand bed in his Boston townhouse. And both of them slept very differently from the enslaved person in the American South or the factory worker in a northern industrial city, or the immigrant in a crowded tenement. Sleep in the 1800s, like everything else, was shaped by the circumstances of a person's life. For the wealthy, sleep was a matter of genuine comfort and even luxury. A rich American family in the mid to late 1800s might have a bedroom that looks surprisingly modern to our eyes. A large, well-furnished room with a fine bed, quality mattresses, quality bedding. They might have a small fireplace in the bedroom to keep it warm through the night. They might have separate rooms for husband and wife if they chose. They might have servants whose jobs included warming the bed, lighting the fires, and bringing a morning tray of tea or coffee. Wealthy households had the luxury of privacy in sleep, privacy that most Americans could only dream of. Rooms with closed doors, beds shared only by choice. A personal, inward, nighttime world of comfort. For the growing urban middle class of the mid to late 1800s, sleep was comfortable but not extravagant. A solid bed, a decent mattress, a separate bedroom in a modest house. Enough blankets, a chamber pot, some privacy. Life was not lavish, but it was dignified. The sleep of the middle class in the late 1800s was, in many ways, the beginning of what we now think of as normal domestic life. For the urban poor, factory workers, immigrants in cities, day laborers, sleep was often genuinely inadequate. Crowded tenement apartments in New York or Chicago or Boston might house many people in very few rooms, multiple families sharing a floor, sleeping in shifts, one group of workers sleeping while another worked because there were not enough beds for everyone to sleep at once. Children sleeping on the floor, on chairs, on piles of clothing. These crowded, noisy, airless spaces were genuinely unhealthy. Reformers who visited urban tenements in the second half of the 1800s wrote with horror about the sleeping conditions, the overcrowding, the lack of light and air, the impossibility of proper rest in such circumstances. Social reformers like Jacob Riis, who photographed and documented the lives of New York City's poor in the late 1800s, showed the world the reality of urban poverty, including how people actually slept. For enslaved people in the American South, one of the darkest chapters of American history, sleep was a complicated and often painful matter. Enslaved people were given sleeping quarters that were typically bare, cold, crowded, and entirely without privacy. Cabins might house many people with minimal bedding and minimal protection from the cold. Sleep time was controlled by others. How much of it you got when it began and ended was not your choice. And yet, within this oppression, enslaved people created their own nighttime culture. The long, dark hours of the night, when the watchful eyes of the enslavers were closed, were sometimes the only hours of relative freedom. Songs were sung, stories were told, community was maintained, religion was practiced, sometimes in secret. The night, paradoxically, was the time when certain aspects of a full human life could be lived. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about sleep and nighttime in 1800s America, that the experience varied so enormously, that for some people, the night was a gentle cocoon of warmth and rest. And for others, it was a place of difficulty, of cold, of noise, of imposed control, of grief. But even in the hardest circumstances, sleep itself, the thing the body does when it finally lets go, was available. Even in the worst conditions, the body sought and found sleep. And in sleep, whatever the circumstances of the waking world, the mind could go somewhere else, could dream, could rest. That is perhaps one of the most profound and humbling things about sleep. It is, in the end, remarkably democratic. The body that sleeps under a feather bed and the body that sleeps on a dirt floor. Both bodies close their eyes, both slow their breathing, both drift into the deep world of sleep, both dream. We have touched on prayer and religious practice throughout our story tonight, but let us spend a little more time here, because for most Americans of the 1800s, religion was not just a part of life. It was the framework through which all of life was understood, and that included sleep and night and dreams. The 1800s was a deeply religious century in America. Churches were the centers of community life. The Bible was the most widely read book. Religious revivals swept across the country in waves. The Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s, the various camp meetings and revival movements of the mid-century. Religion was not a private, reserved matter for most Americans. It was emotional, communal, and central. How did this religious life intersect with sleep? Most obviously in prayer. The bookends of morning and evening prayer gave the day a religious frame. You began by acknowledging God, and you ended the same way. The evening prayer was a surrender of the day, a letting go of whatever had happened, good or bad, into the hands of a power greater than oneself. And there is something psychologically very healthy about this, whatever your own beliefs. The act of deliberately releasing the day before sleep, of saying, in essence, I am done now, and whatever comes next is not my responsibility in this moment, is a genuine preparation for rest. Many families pray together as a unit at the end of the evening. The family Bible would be brought out. A passage might be read. The family might kneel together. This practice, family devotions it was called, was considered essential to a properly ordered household by most religious Americans of the era. Children learned their prayers very young. One of the most familiar prayers in 1800s American households was a simple bedtime prayer for children, often attributed to an 18th century source but widely used throughout the 1800s. You may know its opening lines. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. The prayer asks for divine protection through the night, acknowledging both the vulnerability of sleep and the trust placed in a higher power. Many 1800s children said this prayer every single night of their childhood. The night was understood in religious terms as a liminal space, a threshold between the ordinary world and another kind of world. In sleep, the soul was thought to be in a particular state of openness. Dreams could be divine messages. The night was the time when God might speak to the heart in ways that the busy, distracted day did not allow. This understanding of the night as spiritually significant gave sleep a kind of sanctity. Sleep was not just rest for the body, it was rest for the soul. It was a daily death and resurrection. You closed your eyes not knowing for certain if you would open them again, and in the morning you rose renewed. This understanding, which might sound dark to modern ears, was actually experienced as comforting by most people of faith. You gave yourself each night to God's keeping, and in the morning you received yourself back. The fear of dying in one's sleep, which was real, was therefore held alongside a genuine trust. Many Americans of the 1800s genuinely believed that if they died in the night, they would simply go somewhere good. The famous prayer continues, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." This is not a morbid thought for a child to go to sleep with. It is an expression of complete trust, of surrender. There is something in that quality of surrender, the willingness to let go completely, to entrust oneself to the darkness and to whatever watches over the darkness, that speaks to something very deep in the human experience of sleep, because sleep does require surrender. You cannot force it, you cannot control it. At some point, you simply have to let go. And the people of the 1800s, embedded in their religious culture, had a framework for that letting go that made it feel not terrifying, but sacred. As we move now toward the close of our story tonight, let that idea of surrender settle gently over you. The day is behind you. The night is here. Whatever you are holding, you can set it down. Whatever worries have been circling, they can rest. You are safe, you are cared for, and sleep is coming, as it always does, to carry you gently through the dark. We are getting close to the end of our journey now, so let us spend a few gentle moments at the very edge of the 1800s, at the close of the century, when something was about to change that would transform the nighttime world forever. By the 1880s and 1890s, electricity was beginning to arrive. Thomas Edison had developed his practical electric light bulb in 1879. By the 1880s, electric lighting was beginning to appear in the wealthiest homes and the most modern streets of large American cities. For those who encountered it for the first time, electric light was astonishing. A light that could be switched on and off instantly. A light that did not flicker in the breeze. A light that did not smell, did not require trimming or filling, did not burn down or go out. A clean, steady, bright, controllable light. And this light, this wonderful revolutionary light, began very gradually to push back the darkness, to extend the evening, to change the relationship between human beings and the night that had been unchanged for all of human history. People who had been going to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock because there was simply nothing else to do in the dark suddenly found themselves with options. You could read clearly in electric light. You could work. You could socialize. You could stay up, and they did. Bedtimes began to shift slowly in the homes and neighborhoods that had electricity. The long, quiet dark of the pre-electric evening began to shorten. The ancient two-sleep pattern began to fade as people's total sleep time was compressed by later bedtimes. By the early 1900s, just a breath beyond our story tonight, this process was well underway. And within a few more decades, it would transform nighttime life in America completely. But in 1890, in 1895, most of America was still dark at night, still candlelit and firelit, still following the ancient rhythm of darkness and sleep. The change was coming, but it had not arrived yet for most people. And in those last years of the 1800s, the nighttime world was still the world we have been inhabiting tonight. The world of quilts and nightcaps and bedtime prayers, the world of two sleeps and quiet middle-of-the-night wakefulness, the world of roosters at dawn and banked fires and chamber pots and lullabies, a simpler world, a darker world, a world more deeply connected to the natural rhythms of light and rest and season. There is, I think, something worth honoring in that world. Not because it was easier, it was not. Not because it was better in every way. It certainly was not. People suffered in it. People were cold and sick and frightened and grieving and exhausted in ways that we have largely been able to ameliorate with the gifts of modernity. But in that world, sleep was natural. Sleep was complete. Sleep was, for those who could access its peace, something surrendered to rather than fought against. The darkness came, the body knew what to do, and the night carried people gently from one day to the next. And so, my friend, we have come to the end of our long, slow journey through the sleeping world of 1800s America. We have walked through the deep natural darkness of a pre-electric night. We have stepped into the simple bedrooms of farm families, with their handmade quilts and straw mattresses, and candle stubs on the windowsill. We have watched families gather in the fading firelight for their evening prayers and their bedtime routines. We have settled into the mystery of the two sleeps, the ancient natural pattern of sleeping and waking and sleeping again that our ancestors simply took for granted. We have sat with the quiet fears of the night, the banked fire, the watching over sick children, the darkness outside that was full of sounds the imagination could color however it liked. We have traveled with weary strangers to crowded tavern sleeping rooms. We have felt the weight of winter quilts and the relief of a summer breeze through an open window. We have heard the distant roosters and the morning fire catching. We have followed the turning of seasons through the bedrooms and porches and barns and fields of 100 different American lives. We have sat with the women who kept watch through the long, sick nights. with the children who said their prayers and tucked their hands under their cheeks and let sleep come, with the families who shared warmth and space and breath in small rooms through cold winters. And in all of this, what do we find? We find something very human, something very continuous. People have always needed sleep. People have always found ways to make peace with the dark. People have always gathered together for warmth and comfort when the light goes out. People have always carried their prayers and their fears and their love into the night and woken in the morning, most mornings, to begin again. You are part of that long, long story. Right now, in this moment, you are doing what human beings have always done. You are resting. You are letting the day go. You are giving yourself to the dark and the quiet and the warmth. The world outside can wait. Your thoughts can slow. Your body knows what to do. There is no candle to blow out, but you can let the light of the day grow dim in your mind. There is no straw mattress, but your bed is warm. There are no quilts exactly like the ones pieced together by the women of the 1800s, but you are covered and you are safe. Imagine, just for a moment, that gentle darkness, that complete, soft quiet. No screens, no notifications, no lights on the horizon. Just the dark and the warmth and the faint sound of your own breathing. Somewhere, back in time, a mother is humming to a child. A farmer is listening to the last creak of the barn in the wind. A woman is setting the final stitch in a winter quilt. An old man is watching the embers die down in the hearth, his hand still and warm in his lap. And all of them are drifting, just as you are drifting now, into the quiet, into the warmth, into the deep, restoring ancient gift of sleep. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. You can let it all go. The day, the week, the worries, the plans. They will all be there in the morning, patient and waiting. But tonight they can rest, and so can you. Sleep well, sleep long, sleep deep. Good night.